in addition to being a general assignment reporter in Indianapolis, I started anchoring the noon news, which we call the used news sometimes, because to fill up a half hour of news often meant we borrowed heavily from that morning's edition of the CBS Morning News or from last night's news. I mean, a lot of recycling went on. I also was promoted to the Saturday evening news, which I would do by myself. I mean, you write the show and produce the show, and so I'd be in the newsroom with myself and the sportscaster and the weatherman, both of whom were really pros, total pros, and me not feeling like such a pro, because I was still I was very young and still not that experienced. But in 1972, 3, 4, still not that many women on camera. More women reporters, but not so many women anchors. Which is why someone my age had a lot more on-camera experience in an anchor role than women who had, a decade or 2 decades experience in journalism, who may have been, reporters in the field, but they hadn't been given a chance to anchor. So now comes kind of a big push to get women in anchor roles. And the most likely candidates are girls like me, who have had this window of opportunity. So in the spring of '75, when Indianapolis, the station I worked for, was replacing the co-anchor of the evening news was gone, and it seemed to me that I was the likely candidate. And in fact, I filled in for a couple months and learned many years later that the couple months when I was the interim anchor of the weekday edition of Evening News with Mike Ahern in Indianapolis, that we had been #1 in the ratings. We had not been #1 in the ratings before that. And yet the ownership of the station here in New York City didn't feel that Indianapolis was ready for a female anchor of the major evening news. Weekends, fine, but So I wasn't going to get the job, which was very disappointing. And yet at the same time, I start getting phone calls. Got a call from Buffalo, somewhere in Ohio, I think. So obviously I'm out there. Got a call from Atlanta, WSB in Atlanta, huge, important, regional television market, an important station. And they flew me down for an audition. Of course, I had to do this on the QT. So I did an audition, and it was terrifying because it was a much bigger operation than Wish TV in Indianapolis. And I was scared to death. I did an on-camera thing. I don't know, I remember, but at the end of the day, they told me that their legal department had been looking at my contract. And the contract means that I had a letter of agreement with Channel 8. It wasn't, you wouldn't look at it, it was a letter. And our legal department's been looking at this letter, and they say they've never seen a more ironclad that they couldn't touch me. In fact, even bringing me down, they probably were in some breach of my letter. And so I flew back to Indianapolis pretty confident that, being Southern gentlemen, instead of saying, you don't get the job, they just said that they couldn't hire me. So I totally believed that I didn't get the job. So I go home to Indianapolis. Then I get a call from Philadelphia. A station is trying to compete with a new local phenomenon named Jessica Savage. She had been so phenomenal in Houston, I think, that some local DJ wrote a song about her. She was, and then she's moving up, and now she's a sensation in Philadelphia. And I hadn't heard of her except on the phone. This guy wants me to come and be Jessica Savage's competition, and all I know about her, there are a lot of consonants in that name, and she sounds tough. I don't think so. But no, these phone calls, unsolicited phone calls. Saturday, the weekend of the Indianapolis 500, I'm preparing my newscast, and I have this thought that race weekend in Indianapolis, 500,000 people are in town, that there were going to be a lot of people watching my newscast that night. I wonder if anybody special is going to be watching my newscast that night, because there were celebrities in town, and it was exciting to be in Indianapolis in May, and especially the weekend of the Indy 500. And it turned out someone was watching, because Monday or Tuesday, or maybe Tuesday or Wednesday after the race, phone rings in the newsroom, and a guy says, "I'm sorry, Miss Pauley, I don't know your first name, but I hear you're pretty good." He introduced himself as news director at WMAQ in Chicago, and could I send him a reel? Now, I'm the only reporter in the newsroom, probably the only reporter in Indianapolis or any major city in the country who didn't have a reel, which kind of says something about how ambitious I maybe wasn't. I mean, I was ambitious enough to be disappointed when they didn't promote me to anchor, but all of everybody I'm sitting next to, they've been sending reels all over the country, and I didn't even have one. And one of the cameramen, and I felt so guilty. It's like cheating on your boyfriend or something. But one of the young photographers, I went to him, and he put together, he edited, my greatest hits. I'm sure, me standing in the farm, that was certainly on the mud story was certainly on my greatest hits. So I send this letter, enclosed you'll find my, my reel, P.S., an addendum. I've just won an Associated Press Award for Best Feature, which I thought was very clever of me to write that in an addendum. A week goes by, he calls. Could I come up to Chicago and meet him? So now I have to get up to Chicago some evening and be back at work the next morning without telling anybody where I've been. So I go up to Chicago, catch a flight, and I meet people. They put me on camera with Floyd Kalber, who was, a giant in Chicago news circles. Chicago was a big print town, front page, hello. 3 major, mighty, muscular newspapers, and with very little use for broadcasting, but Floyd Kalber was respected. And he so dominated local news in Chicago that because of the time zone change, his 10 o'clock newscast fit in the realm of prime time. And there were evenings where his 10 o'clock newscast would be amongst the top 10 programs, primetime programs for the week. That's how he dominated local news in Chicago, until a phenomenon that came to be known as Happy Talk changed everything. It was kind of goofball news, high on personality, a lot of features, wacky weatherman, anchors that kind of, ad-libbed and gabbed, and, it wasn't news, but it was really popular, and it was born in Chicago. So where Floyd Kalber had been, the giant in local news, suddenly he'd fallen. He wasn't even in second place. There were nights he wasn't even in third place. So they needed to do something. They were looking for a co-anchor. I don't think they specifically were looking for a female. And the guy who saw me the weekend of the Indianapolis 500, when I had kind of wondered, I wonder who's in town, was actually in town scouting someone at a different station. and someone unrelated to the station, to NBC at all, as a matter of fact, had also seen me, said, made a phone call. There's this young woman in Indianapolis you ought to look at. That's why they didn't know my name.
Wow.
So when I get up there to do the audition, it goes well, and in addition to doing some on-camera work with a teleprompter, and I don't think I'd ever worked with a teleprompter before, they had some crosstalk between Floyd Kalber and me, and Floyd talked about politics, Indiana politics. Well, I was conversant. I look smart. So the audition went really well. I knew it. And as I was being walked back to a car to take me to the hotel where I was going to spend the night before I flew back to Indianapolis really early the next morning, the news director, Ed Planer, says to me, "How old did you say you were?" And I said, let me see, 23. I was still 23. I hadn't turned 24 yet. Or was I 24? Let's say I'm 24. Whatever it was. I'm a lot older now. Whatever it was, he kind of shook his head, and he didn't tip his hand any further than that. And I went back to the hotel, which overlooked the Chicago River. And I didn't sleep at all that night. I'm looking out the window and I see the dawn arising over the city of Chicago, which is a spectacular view. And though I didn't know if I had the job, I thought I probably did. And I had I guess the one and only epiphany I've ever had in my life, that things are changing now. So I go back to Indianapolis and I don't hear anything. I hear nothing. Until there's a newspaper, a gossip columnist, that says that WMAQ is hiring a woman from Indianapolis. That was how I first heard. And it was very glowing, and it's kind of exciting. And then I get the call, and sure enough, this is a far longer story than you want to hear, but I was under contract, and the station ownership in Indianapolis wasn't going to let me go. All summer long I was on ice. They didn't say no, they didn't say yes, until NBC called and told the general manager in Indianapolis, we're going to have to rescind the offer because, we've got to move, and if you're not going to let her go, we've got to make other plans. And at that, they let me go.